Do you need a web application security solution that can improve your detection rate and enable easier remediation? Acunetics has a fully automated solution that can detect and report over 4,500 web vulnerabilities. Fast and scalable, it can scan thousands of pages without interruption, including HTML5, JavaScript, and single-page applications. Acunetics provides accuracy with the lowest false positives by combining black box and white box testing. For more information, visit acunetics.com/Security Weekly.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by James Wickett. RSA Conference 2019 is the place to be for the latest in cybersecurity data, innovation, and thought leadership. From March 4th to 8th, San Francisco will come alive with cybersecurity's brightest minds as they gather together to discuss the industry's newest developments. Go to rsaconference.com/Security Weekly-US19 to register now using discount code 5U9SWFD to receive $100 off a full conference pass. Security Weekly will be in Broadcast Alley on Monday and Tuesday of RSA Conference, recording sponsored interviews and hosting briefings. We'll be sharing more details soon. All right, James, let's dig into the news for this week.
All right.
And based on Keith's format, I always, he kind of wants to look at the bugs and stuff. And the first article that popped up was Oracle's announcement last week of 284 vulnerabilities in their January critical patch update. I don't think many people were surprised, but I think most people would think it was Java, but it wasn't. It was actually the Fusion middleware product that had the most vulnerabilities.
That's right. Yeah, we kind of leap to thinking that it's going to be the Java stack, but no. Oracle owns a lot of stuff nowadays, and I was just reading that, and I was like, I'm glad I'm not responsible for patching some Oracle right now.
Yeah, agreed. Now, obviously, there's a lot of Java users still out there in the enterprise space, which is where we usually think of Oracle bugs. But I don't know how big is the Fusion middleware product line for Oracle? Is it still a pretty big part of their business? Are a lot of people using it, or is it not that big of an issue?
I'm not really sure. I would imagine still pretty big. I mean, it feels like Oracle. I have a lot of folks that still work in enterprise that I know that use Oracle. I feel like they're pretty still into it a lot. So, yeah, I don't know the actual saturation there.
Yeah, that's a lot of vulnerabilities to go get patched in your enterprise Oracle stuff.
So you hear it here. Patch up, guys.
Yeah, right. Need help with that. We know a few people that might be able to help. The second article was interesting. This is the Mac malware OSX.doc is back, actively infecting victims. This is an old bug from 2017 that now has kind of remutated itself and is back going after the OSX population.
I know. I thought we could just skip this and move right to the Android because let's pick on Android. But no, yeah, we're still seeing this bug come out, and it's emitting a lot of the log data back into the nefarious dark web.
Yeah, interesting. What they did here was kind of updated this with a new icon to entice people to double click it to install this through a phishing campaign, which it's all they did is kind of put lipstick on the pig here and said, oh, look, will you double click this one for me? So I thought it was an interesting approach. All right. So you want to get to the Android one, right?
Oh, well, I mean, if you must, yeah, we should pick on that one.
Yeah, so bug in Twitter Android app expose protected tweets. And this was only for the Android app. The OSX app and the web interface were not impacted by this bug.
Yeah, no, something like for 5 years worth of Twitter data, right?
Yeah, from November 3rd, 2014 to January 14th, 2019, when the patch was released. So yeah, almost 5 years.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty interesting. It was a bug in Linux. So back to your point, right? There's a bug in a code base, but it's only one code base. It's not all their code base. Mm-hmm. That eventually turns into a security gap.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So supposedly it's been fixed. So the protect your tweet setting can be re-enabled and supposedly is working again. So we'll see.
Well, and then we have the next Android one down there, the ES File Explorer, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this is, potentially impacting 100 million users. So this is pretty potentially a pretty big vulnerability here.
That's right. Yeah. It set up a access, just had an open port on your device. So if you've ever connected to it, then anybody on a local network could now connect to your Android device and pull off any data that it could get to, I think. So, it looks like they have patches coming out for it or have already released it, but that's a real big local network type security issue. So if you go to a conference and you're on the Wi-Fi or any other coffee shop or whatever, it's pretty critical.
Yeah. So they talk about impact. It's embedded in over 100 million installs, and it listens on port 59777. So that's how they're actually able to listen on that open port and get some data. All right, let's go to our "If you build it, they will come." Let's see about that. In here I pulled some interesting articles, and the first one was Onapsis to buy cybersecurity firm Virtual Forge to boost its SAP defenses. For people who know Onapsis, they were kind of the first ones to really go after SAP security. So it looks like they're buying another security firm to kind of help boost those SAP defenses.
How big is this for the industry?
I mean, SAP still has a pretty big following, right? I mean, you still have three major ERP players left in the space. You've got Salesforce.com, that's the big behemoth. Oracle has still a big presence in the ERP space. And then SAP's, in that top three. So the question is, what additional features are they bringing to bear? But SAP still has a pretty broad distribution. So I think there's still a big market for this.
Okay.
Yeah. I know Europe still has a lot of SAP, and I think we do here in various organizations in the States. Yeah. This next one, Paul and I covered this last week on Enterprise Security Weekly, but I brought it forward to this one because I wanted the application security audit to get this one, and that is Zix to acquire AppRiver, a cloud-based cybersecurity solutions provider. And what's really interesting about this acquisition, James, is that AppRiver is like twice the size of Zix. Zix is a public company. Their market cap last week was about $300 million. They're paying $275 million in cash to buy AppRiver and integrate it in with Zix. So it's big. I mean, this is a really big, and it's kind of a weird acquisition, but it's bringing some application capabilities into the Zix portfolio, which I thought was interesting.
How does something like that happen?
I don't know. Well, there's a couple different ways this could happen. AppRiver could, they could be looking for an exit, and maybe there's some common investors. I didn't dig into who the investors were, but how does you almost think the opposite, right? You think AppRiver would buy somebody like Zix if they wanted to bring some security components together, but yeah, this is a really weird acquisition for me, which is why we covered it, and why I wanted to bring it up again, because I'm not sure how many people are using AppRiver and whether they view this as a positive or a negative if they're using AppRiver, and what this acquisition potentially looks like for them. So if there's any listeners out there, I'd love their insight into whether they think this is good or bad, because I'd really be interested, because it's a crazy acquisition.
All right, phone into us. Let us know. We got to find out.
Yeah, I want to find out. Now we'll go into our learning segment that Keith likes to talk about. And this ties into our conversation we just had, which is there's an article from HelpNet Security talking about protecting privileged access in DevOps and cloud environments. And they give some good recommendations. I think, we kind of talked through these in the last segment a little bit, James, but what is your take on a couple of these?
Yeah. So they break down kind of where all the spots are. You could add sort of testing and put those in place where you should kind of think about your pipeline. Is there anything in specific you were thinking about on that?
Well, I mean, obviously they talk about the transformation of the security team into DevOps partners, right? So, this was this conversation you and I had. But yeah, like where are some of those integration points? Because I think that's where it gets really interesting as we think about security and where it sits in the DevOps cycle is a really interesting discussion to me, because that starts to show us what kind of tools we should be looking at from the security side and which tools with DevOps they integrate with.
Yeah, and there's a couple. So there's a few articles in the learning and tools section that I think cover a piece of that, and I think they sort of pair nicely the top 2 points there. The how you do vulnerability management and think about the code that you're baking in, all your security vulnerabilities, or all the code that it takes to build it in there. They don't use these words exactly, but your software bill of materials, everything that's kind of baked into your system. I felt like that was really helpful to think through, and I think there's a lot of vendors in that space that are good to look at. And then on the other side there's the API side. So everything is, we just mentioned earlier, it's like everything's now becoming an API and it has been for a while now. And everything's we're having this microservices kind of renaissance that's going on here. And that's letting us connect everything, and we're able to put a lot of stuff together. But now you have all your application security stuff is rolled forward, and so even though you're doing serverless, like you still got to be thinking about what are the account takeover options? What are the is cross-site scripting still relevant in APIs? The answer, yes, of course it is. Command execution, things like that. That OWASP top 10 is actually more relevant in a microservices environment than it is without it. So taking a look at these options I think are pretty helpful for us to sort of resonate with where developers are building code. Where do you instrument it for actually doing static code analysis and doing like pieces looking for what you're trying to find? And then the inverse of what are the feedback loops you can instrument from your runtime production to give alerting, like, are we under account takeover right now, or are different pieces of our site being attacked, and understanding what they are. And so those are the 2 kind of main endpoints where I suggest people kind of put and both those articles kind of hit on that.
Yeah, and the one on vulnerability management was interesting to me because there's a couple tools he didn't mention in here, which I thought was interesting because we've seen this space kind of evolve over the past couple years, where you have Black Duck was doing open source, White Source is out there, which he names, but he doesn't name Black Duck. Sonatype, the other one that's kind of out
Sonatype
there.
Was
these guys have been out there for a while doing this, but then you have Claire,
source clear, yeah.
Claire's been doing aspects of this too, and so there's lots of different tools out there looking at kind of the static code analysis components of containers and the open source libraries, et cetera, because that's how we're deploying them now as containers. So I think there's a lot of tools out there that can help folks really get their arms around the VM side of this.
Yeah, it helps people break down how did just go back and as you're looking at your software, like how did the software that I'm delivering now, where did that come from? How did it get to the state that it is? And at different checkpoints, are we looking for, doing some sort of code scanning, dependencies scanning, understanding what are that whole idea of software bill of materials? What are all the pieces that I'm bundling into my app that are also leaving me vulnerable? And understanding what the risk is there. So I think that's a lot of those tooling that you just mentioned, like those all kind of focus in on that problem.
Right. Yep. And definitely a requirement in your testing cycle, but it goes beyond that. And that's kind of what the API article gets into a little bit, because as you said, right, as we create microservice architectures and we create this really distributed application environment, there's a ton of API communication happening back and forth. And I don't think most people realize how just huge it is, but then how to do anything about it. How do you protect it? Because it's something we've never really thought about. Sometimes in our application security testing, we think about testing the code and testing the server that it runs on and these other aspects. And now you've got all this communication via APIs happening behind the scenes that no one's really understood how to protect.
Yeah, and if you rewind the clock, 10 years where you're kind of running this in your data center, and sure, maybe you had a service-oriented architecture back then, and this is sort of a take two of that in the modern world. But in those days, like, you kind of put all those services or all those pieces together like in one tier, one box, whatever. So you could sort of isolate that doing some controls. But here, this is a completely distributed system. You may run certain APIs and maybe with a Lambda with like Firebase or something. You have some other APIs with Auth and other stuff set up. So you've sort of taken apart your actual software, and no longer are you this kind of 3-tier web app or this multi-layer thing that sort of sits in your data center that you can kind of wrap security controls around. Now you've taken everything and put all the transport over HTTP, HTTPS, and now you're and you've distributed across a bunch of services, some that you own and servers that you don't own, and so it is more difficult. So having instrumentation across those applications and understanding like who's talking to who, and being able to look at patterns that are happening through those, I think are really critical.
Yeah, and this one, it touches on a few basics, right? Encrypt everything with TLS, to encrypt that traffic. That makes sense. Focus on authentication, making sure you have authentication to those APIs so you can control the access. Rate limiting, I thought, was a really interesting one, because now these APIs can be used for brute force types of attacks if you don't put some rate limiting on, because you could overwhelm the application through brute force on the API, which I didn't even think about at first.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and one of the things that I think is unique about serverless that I haven't really seen anything about it just yet, or at least my mind's blanking if we've actually seen real attacks on this, but serverless, you pay for the amount of compute time you're actually using, right? So old cloud, or if you just did like EC2 instances on Amazon, and you flooded the machine, or you did a denial of service, like, yeah, maybe you would crash that instance, but you're not going to actually cost the organization more money. But what if you could flood a stack of Lambdas and get them all busily computing for hours and days on end, just kind of recycling all those, and have to cross 1,000 Lambdas wide for a large amount of time. Now, in addition to denying the service, you're also costing that organization a ton of money, because they're going to be there once their Amazon bill comes in. They're going to be quite surprised. So, anyways, there's attack vectors that exist out there that aren't in this model as well that we have to think about. And so, looking at sort of the fundamentals, and that article had the basics, right? How you do encryption, instrument your auth pieces. For work at Signal Sciences, we help people like instrument like login success, login failure, password reset, and then like when you start seeing that over time, you kind of get some idea of like, is this good activity or bad activity, and we're able to discern that out of the mess.
Yeah, and that's that tying to the behavior patterns, right? What does normal login?
What is log off? We don't even know what that looks like. Yeah,
exactly right. Yeah. And I think that's where we're going to see the future of application on the runtime side, is really starting to understand normal behavior, especially in a highly distributed world. Should this microservice talk to that microservice or not? That behavior matters when you think about enforcement at runtime, that you really don't see or understand until the application actually starts to run. And so I think over time, understanding these behaviors and these patterns will actually help us do a better job of protecting the application when it's running.
That's right. Right on.
All right. Synopsys updates Coverity with some enhanced analysis capabilities. What I like, what's interesting about Synopsys to me, it's a company that I track, is, Synopsys is known really for like their chip design work, but Synopsys over the years has built up this really interesting application security portfolio. They've acquired Coverity and Black Duck and a number of companies, and I think we're going to continue to see announcements like this on, this is static analysis. This is static analysis, security testing enhancements. But, you're going to see more of these types of tools, more of these, I think, integrated portfolio of tools that continue to come out to really try to help us in the overall pipeline of protecting the application.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're seeing these types of tools, like they're not only providing feedback to developers when they check into a build system, but there's also plugins for your IDEs. There's other stuff that's going on to help provide that feedback loop in a lot of other places. So this is to that point we talked about earlier. It's like you could provide testing, or you could provide failure and error codes to developers. And one actually speaks their language, which is oh, hey, that's red. I want to get that to pass. Like, what do I have to do to get that pass? Click it. Oh, I should not have, for example, cross-site scripting or whatever. It's like, all right, I want to sanitize my input here. Do that. Check it back in. It's good to go. That is worth all the security training classes you could throw at a developer. But if you have something like right in their IDE or right in the build system, like that's where we got to focus on our tooling.
Yes, agreed. And those types of integrations are going to be important. That's how we shift security left as much as we can.
Boom.
Do you know the Site Check website scanner? I was not familiar with this tool, but I thought it was interesting because there's, this tool allows you to go out and crawl the website and look for different vulnerabilities. There's a ton of commercial products that do this, but this was a free product that I thought was interesting to bring up to the audience.
Yeah, it looks like it looks at some things like some headers and some other things to evaluate, like what kind of your HTTPS setup. So yeah, there's some other free tools out there. Names of them are escaping me right now that do a subset of these pieces, but yeah, this is a cool tool.
Yeah, so it's a Site Check website scanner for anybody that is interested. Just some new enhancements. I just thought it was a very interesting free tool for app developers to use. All right, let's dig into our food for thought segment. And the first article I pulled was Australia businesses increasingly embrace artificial intelligence. And it wasn't really the artificial intelligence angle that I really cared about here, but I wanted to bring up this aspect of the market that I don't think most people fully understand. Australia has been a really early adopter of technologies. And as we think about where the US is going when it comes to cloud and containers and eventually artificial intelligence, some of these other things, Australia was there way before most of the US companies in mass. And, I used to travel down there a lot when I was with Tenable as we were building out our presence down in the Asia Pacific. I was amazed at the maturity level of all the companies that we talked to about cloud, big adopters of AWS, but more, they were really at the cutting edge of containers. This was a few years ago. And so here you see them also really embracing artificial intelligence. And I think it's interesting to watch some of the trends of how Australia is using this, because it might give us some precursors of what's to come here in the US, because typically Australia has been a little ahead of us in some of these new technologies.
That's cool. Yeah, I didn't even know that about Australia being an early adopter on stuff.
Yeah, it was weird. This was back in, it must have been late 2015 or early 2016, sitting down with Telstra doing deep dives on container security. And this was really before container security solutions really existed. I mean, they were deploying solutions already in containers and trying to figure out how to protect them. And, this was well before some of these newer startups came to the market here in the US. But yeah, Australia was doing it pretty early. The second article I brought up, and this one's a little interesting. This is a broader market one, but I'm going to focus on a subset of this in a second. Cybersecurity market's growing at a CAGR of 11.45% from 2019 to 2025. So cybersecurity we know is growing. It's great. This is a whole number, James. So 11.45% across multiple segments, and each segment grows at a different rate. We know traditional vulnerability management is there growing faster. The reason I brought this up is because AppSec is one of those areas that's growing faster. And it's not in this article, but I did some cross correlation because I've been tracking this application security market for a while. And there's an adjacent report out there that says application security market worth $10.7 billion by 2025 with a 17.7% CAGR. So the reason I brought this up is $10.7 billion, that's a pretty big submarket under cybersecurity. First of all, much bigger than some of the other markets we've thought about over the years, right? AppSec wasn't that big, but it's growing really, really fast and becoming a big part of the overall cybersecurity market. But the other thing was its growth rate at 17.7%. This is one of those emerging spaces, a space that you're in, obviously with Signal Sciences, a space I was in at Layered Insight with container security. This is where some of those big growth rates are. And it will be interesting to see what kind of innovation and things we see in the AppSec specific market.
That's good. I like this article. It was helpful for me because I was thinking, and your comments right here have been really helpful because I've always felt like AppSec, it sort of started, you could argue like, 99, 2000, cross-site scripting started becoming a thing, and OWASP, and there, kind of those like the initial steps that we took. But now that with the kind of the destruction of like what we talked about earlier of like the traditional, web application market, and now there's these APIs distributed everywhere, and your data's kind of running in multiple clouds, and now everything's talking HTTP, HTTPS, and so now we see AppSec really kind of growing to the forefront, and that's like one of those areas where maybe NetSec kind of, I don't know how this correlates here. Maybe you can answer this for me too. But like, where does NetSec in this kind of spin? Right? Is that decreasing and AppSec is increasing? Could be they're both increasing and going up. But yeah, it's like that's like the one layer that we still like layer 7. Like we still need to do a lot of work, and we still have a lot of problems that are existing in this space. And it's all the stuff that people care about, right? It's like it's my accounts, it's my data, my transaction history, it's the ability to access other stuff. So I find this to be spot on, and I'm a believer in these numbers, or at least with some degree of certainty.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, what I've traditionally seen and kind of prepared for years ago was a move away from host-based security and network-based security longer term. The move to the cloud allows abstraction of both the host and the network. And we see this with serverless today, right?
Yeah.
And so what does that mean for the future? The perimeter, we've been saying the perimeter's porous, right? It is. It's kind of vanishing. But I see the application as the new perimeter. It is the thing people will interact with as its kind of main entry point. And so to me, what you'll see is NetSec and perimeter-based security over time move and morph into kind of application security as that becomes the new perimeter. And there was another acquisition last week that we covered on Enterprise Security Weekly, which was Check Point's acquisition of ForceNock, I believe, which was an application security company.
Okay.
That's what I'm talking about. Taking a perimeter guy like Check Point, bringing application security capabilities, both web app and some API protections. That's going to be part of that transition. So over time, I would expect potentially network security, endpoint security growth rates to slow, which is why you see, accelerated growth on application security as a shift continues to happen. I've always been a believer at the end of this digital transformation process, whenever it ends, there are 3 main types of security controls we still have to worry about: application, user, and data. Everything else may be abstracted, but those 3 are going to survive in some form or fashion in our future world.
Yeah, I love that. I think you're spot on with that.
So we'll see how it plays out, but right now the growth rate shows some great future in the application security market. James, thank you for joining us today.
Hey, thanks,
Thank
Matt.
you, everyone. Yeah, thanks everybody else for joining us. We'll see you next week on Application Security Weekly.